Good morning, all. Welcome to the first 5 webinar of 2026. Morning, Bratcher. Morning, Tanner.
Morning, sir.
Hope everyone's new year is starting off strong. You know, I say that out loud, and I'm not really sure when you're supposed to stop wishing people Happy New Year. But what is it? It's the 22nd. I think it's time, right? We're all adults here. We can make that call. No more Happy New Year references after today. Bratcher, Tanner, you with
Got
me?
it. Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Good. So if nothing else you get from this call, you're relieved of that burden. But welcome. I'm Brian Hayduck. I'm one of the founders here at Five and the CEO. I am joined in this webinar by Eric Bratcher, our Chief Risk Officer and Senior Zoltar, and Tanner Leahy, one of our senior market analysts and junior Zoltar. If you are still struggling with that Zoltar reference, keep researching. You're a little too young. Keep up the research. You'll get there. We are structuring this webinar a little bit different than the previous ones. We're trying a shorter form. It's more of a quick, I'll say, reintroduction of the topic, maybe a little less time in the weeds. You'll still be able to ask questions using the Q&A feature on the webcast. The topic for this call is demand response, but we're going to start a little bit off script. We got a big winter storm that's in the news, obviously some relevance to demand response. I don't know if they've named this one yet, but I'm going to hand it to Bratcher first with a little bit of some insight into this storm, what it means.
Yeah, we'll talk about this just for a couple minutes and maybe paint the picture a little bit about why this topic is relevant. And this is just a real life example of sometimes it hits and the timing is great. So decent amount of cold weather coming into the upper Midwest over the next couple days. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Chicago are getting hit kind of today, and then that cold front continues to move down through the Midwest and even down into Texas, at least the upper part of Texas, at the beginning of this weekend, and then slowly shift east as the weekend progresses and kind of sink down over the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states by the time we get to the first half of next week. From a grid reliability point of view, you're starting to see some of that risk kind of sink in this weekend. We could see natural gas prices would be probably the first kind of thing that's popped. So if you are a curtailed natural gas customer, specifically in the upper Midwest, you'll likely start receiving those notifications yesterday or even today, but definitely by the time we get to this weekend, those are likely probable. We're also seeing some of those natural gas curtailment notifications in North Texas already for this weekend. That may extend itself to the Northeast by the time we get into this weekend and earlier next week. From a grid reliability point of view, the forecast for electricity looks okay. Most of the grids, PJM, New York, and ERCOT, don't hit their peaks until later on in the weekend, even early on Monday. So this is the forecast for PJM, and the top table at the top right-hand corner kind of shows you those peak demands over the next few days. And you can see the Saturday peak of 139 is the evening peak, and then again on Tuesdays about 141. Those are relatively high. They almost match the peak demands last winter on Martin Luther King weekend. So it will, those 3 days of peak demands should be in the top 10 weather events. But last year we performed okay. The market for PJM performed okay at similar forecasts. So as long as this forecast kind of holds, there isn't widespread fear of a grid failure. We might see some curtailment request later on in the week, like Monday or Tuesday. Is probably more likely as that cold continues to move east and hits more of the eastern half of PJM. But from a New York point of view, that peak day is also around Tuesday of next week. and their peak demand is almost exactly the same in relative terms. It's almost exact same as last year's Martin Luther King weekend. So it's about 23 to 23,500 megawatts. So high for a winter peak, but nothing that we haven't seen before. In ERCOT, the forecast kind of reaches its high on Monday morning, ERCOT being Texas, with values that are just a little bit higher than the February storm of last year. That it helps that the cold front doesn't really get into the middle of the state and South Texas until Monday. So Monday from a grid reliability, Monday morning from a grid reliability in Texas is probably the bullseye.
So yeah, the thing that I would add there too is if because it's potential, right? There's weekend days in here. If you do participate in DR or you curtail load because you're on index, dust off your plans, right? Who's supposed to do what by when? What's the communication chain? Where does the DR sort of communication come from? Just whatever your plan is for reacting to these types of events, time to dust those off. If you have backup generation, I'd make sure that's in working order. All of those typical things that you go through, I would run through that checklist.
Yeah, I would say that from the price risk this weekend and into early next week is a lot higher than grid reliability risk. It's a lot more likely that in the Midwest and the Northeast, we see elevated to maybe highly elevated natural gas prices, which will cause all electricity prices to be elevated. That's probably the highest risk. If you do have index exposure to natural gas or electricity prices, more of a financial risk than a grid reliability risk on this event.
Okay, good. Hope that detour was helpful. All right, so we'll get back to our regularly scheduled program here. So the subtitle of this webinar is strategy hiding in plain sight, right? And we made that mysterious, not because we're looking for a movie deal. It's because most of you guys have looked at these types of things before. Demand response is probably not something new for folks. You've done it, you've thought about it, you've tried it at some point. But there are some really good reasons to revisit, right, if you're not participating now. And to that end, I wanted to bring up this graphic from our last webinar, which was what makes up your energy bill, right? And this one was from PJM. And there's a couple things to note here that I think are relevant to this conversation. One is, and everybody's aware of these, right? The number in the middle, that's a big number. It's likely never been bigger, just in terms of your total electricity costs, given the way both delivery and supply have been going. Important thing for this conversation, almost 90% of that bill, almost that entire wheel, can be impacted by curtailing your load. That's important to understand. It's not just one component, it's almost all of it. And the last piece that we'll get into a little bit here there are some new rules that can increase the tools that you have to work with in load flexibility, particularly as it relates to on-site generation. So wanted to sort of lead with that as an entree to this conversation. And with that, Tanner, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, so throughout the rest of this webinar, we're really going to try to answer a couple of questions as it relates to demand response. So what is demand response? Why is this relevant now? How to participate in demand response? And where is demand response most valuable? So starting out with what is demand response? When you think of the electricity grid, supply has to meet demand every second of every day. Traditionally, what that meant was every time that somebody turned on a factory or a light bulb, somewhere a generator would have to either turn on or ramp up to meet that new demand on the grid. In the case of demand response, it's kind of the opposite. So instead of a generator ramping up, somewhere load would then curtail to meet that increase in demand. So the formal definition of demand response is when electricity users voluntarily change their power consumption in response to price signals or grid needs. So why is that relevant now? I'm sure that everybody in this conversation has talked about AI to some extent. It seems like the follow through of that thread is that data centers are taking up a lot of load. Maybe your electricity bill residentially has increased. Just in the news over the past couple of weeks, I saw Mickey Sherrill the New Jersey governor-elect. She ran her campaign sort of on the thought that New Jersey needs to lower their energy prices residentially. Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, in her State of the State, made several proclamations about how she's personally going to lower the electricity prices for New York residents. And then just last week, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, as well as the 12 other PJM state governors, met with President Trump to talk about how they're going to lower electricity prices going forward. So all of this posits off the thought that energy prices are increasing. So when we look at sort of where prices were between 2015 and 2021, it was relatively tranquil. We had load decreasing through energy efficiency upgrades, and things were relatively tame. As we move into the 2022-2023 period, we had a relatively severe winter of 2022, which led into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You can see this large spike in electricity prices. But since then, we had a 2023 winter that was relatively mild and a 2024 winter that was relatively mild. But despite those winters, electricity prices are still on the rise. This is in large part due to generation retirement, as well as load growth from things such as data centers that we're seeing. Moving over to capacity, which in that price wheel that Hayduck had shown, it represents about 15% of your electricity supply. It's a similar story. So the prices historically have been relatively tame, and then starting in June of 2025, those prices elevated significantly. And in the last two capacity auctions that came out, as we mentioned previously, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, he had put a price ceiling on capacity prices. So these actually cleared at the ceiling without that ceiling in place. Instead of clearing at $320 per megawatt hour, or per megawatt day rather, prices would have cleared around $520, which is approximately the maximum. It's the cost of new entry. Patrick, do you want to add anything on prices?
Yeah, I would say the one thing there is this is the equation, the algorithm that creates those capacity prices is really driven on a supply and demand function, right? So in PJM, you've, like Tanner was saying, you've had a traditional decaying load, and that was okay. You were retiring coal power plants, replacing them with natural gas sometimes, but a declining load pattern was easy for the grid to match. A dramatic increase in load forecast, mostly driven by data centers, but also a handful of other smaller items, definitely shifted that supply-demand equation, that big X that we learned about in economics in college. That supply-demand shift in this algorithm for capacity is the largest impact. There's a couple other smaller impacts, like the accreditation of certain generation assets that influence it minor. But the biggest thing is load is growing faster than supply, and it's hard to find that new generation. It's just hard to build a gas turbine. They are in extreme back order. And so this higher elevated price is something that the market is likely going to be sticking with, not just through this, where this graph ends, but at least the next few years thereafter, just because it's not something that the market can fix in a timely manner.
Thank you. So we posited that electricity prices are higher and kind of proved it here. So what are regulation and regulators actually doing? So one example, recently, this past year, the EPA allowed for Tier 2 generation to begin participating in traditional demand response programs, so long as they're put on by a utility or any other balancing authority, such as an ISO. Tier 2 is sort of a technical way to say a diesel generator with bad emission characteristics. So traditionally, there's sort of two types of generators, Tier 2 and Tier 4. Tier 4 just has better emission characteristics, so it's allowed to run for more hours throughout the year. All of this to say, generators that previously could not participate in demand response are now able to do so. So if you were told previously, maybe it's not a good idea, it's worth revisiting. Which is exactly what one of our clients did. So this is a nationwide hospital, and when you think of a hospital, if the electricity goes out, it's going to be a bad day in the operating room. So hospitals require backup generation to be on site, and as Tier 2 generators, the emergency type, are cheaper, typically a hospital would go with a Tier 2 generator just to ensure that they have that reliability without breaking the bank. In this example, our client, this nationwide hospital, was sort of looking into demand response, and we helped steer and optimize their demand response strategy, which resulted in about a 50% increase in the revenue potential that they could earn, and they're projected to earn about $3 million in 2026 through participation from assets that they had previously and they just weren't really taking advantage of. So how can your facility, how can you participate in demand response? As I sort of previously mentioned, we have like the traditional players where they could use things such as backup generation, and that's sort of where things lied with demand response. As on-site batteries become more of a thing, we're seeing on-site batteries be used. And then in the commercial real estate side of things, we might see some pretty sophisticated controls through BMS or automation systems, BMS just being building management systems, to control HVAC and other loads. And then lastly, we're seeing just the sort of rudimentary turn off heavy equipment, such as Bitcoin miners, or in the case of metal refineries, blast furnaces, that sort of approach. As these values in these programs become higher, it's just worth considering looking into alternative programs. And honestly, what we've seen is that a lot of people are pursuing this, and they're looking at things that traditionally might not have made a huge impact, but they add up. So lighting, HVAC in a more rudimentary sense, redundant equipment. And then some of my favorite examples are sort of like what I would call the ride-through capacity. So with cold storage, if you think of when your power goes out, you just don't open up your freezer, and then you're able to preserve your vegetables for a little bit longer. This is just on a larger scale. So cold storage wouldn't open up their freezers, and they're able to ride through any sort of any sort of event through that momentum that they have in thermal energy. And then similarly with water storage, we've had water authorities that need to pump for a set number of hours throughout a month. It doesn't matter when they pump, and we just advise them to maybe turn off their pumps during some critical hours, and they're able to also participate where they previously thought they couldn't. So in talking to one of our greenhouse clients, and when I say greenhouse, I'm not talking about what I think about when I think about greenhouses, which is like a flower shop or like a mom and pop greenhouse, maybe attached to a Home Depot. This is not the case. So with this client, they have sophisticated controls. There's lighting all over the place, and they're really more of the advanced greenhouse in the sense. So when we were talking to them initially, they said, we need to turn our lights on for 16 hours throughout the day. It didn't matter what hours they were. It didn't matter if you turned them on and off. The sequencing didn't matter. It was just that these plants needed 16 hours of light throughout the day. So in talking in realizing that, we realized that they had an opportunity to curtail their load and make some money from it. So here is their electricity usage on August 20th, where they, at 4 p.m., curtailed their load from 4.4 megawatts down to about 1.2 megawatts, which is about 3.2 megawatts of curtailment. So pretty sizable just from turning off some lights. And they were actually able to make about $105,000 in 2025. When you think about a increase in electricity prices, this corresponds to about half a cent. So they were able to reduce effectively their electricity costs by half a cent per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, I'll take this, Tanner. So this is a quick map of just kind of a quick shot of up to dollars per megawatt year that some of these programs would be beneficial for our clients. This is kind of the stack. So this is kind of like the all-in, doing all the things that were possible for the curtailability of 1 megawatt. And you can see that the upper mid-Atlantic and New York is in the $400,000 per megawatt per year type of range. This is the high end. So this is like hey, we're going to optimize and go in all that we can for a 1 megawatt. But you can kind of get a sense of where that range of curtailability, the value of that curtailability is based on the region. And it is very region specific. The value of a megawatt in Minnesota versus Nebraska versus Texas is very different. Kind of depends on the market structure, the programs that state or region have available, the times that you can run, the seasons. So it's very broad, and optimizing these programs, even though it's not extremely complicated, it is pretty deep. So there's lots of different programs with lots of different rules. But this kind of gives you just a high level sense of what those prices or values may look like across the United States.
Yeah, and the big thing to point out here is that these values have not always been this high. And in pointing that out, we had discussions previously with an industrial client of ours, and they had heard about demand response. They thought, the work to actually participate sounds quite like a lot, as well as the values for participation just don't really make that work worthwhile. And then we met with them, I think around this time last year, and sort of presented that these new values that are a bit higher. We talked to them about how they could participate, and ultimately they decided, yeah, let's give it a shot. Like, there's no real risk in doing so. Just if they participate, they might receive $0. So they did give it a shot. And last year they were able to earn about $1.2 million. So this corresponded to, again, about half a cent of their energy costs for that facility, half a cent per kilowatt hour. So just a really good way to sort of mitigate these risks of higher prices that we're seeing. And ultimately, the one thing that they said to us at the end of the season was, wow, that really was not as hard as we previously made it out to be. And we kind of wish that we were doing it previously. So that was pretty resounding for me. So lastly, we kind of want to end on when are these deadlines coming up? When should I start reaching out and figuring out when to curtail and when to enroll in demand response? So here are the official deadlines. However, I will say it's better to start as soon as possible, honestly. These things take a little bit of time. If you have legal constraints and like a slow review process, it's better to just allow time. So all of these programs are starting to approach their deadline, and we recommend reaching out as soon as possible.
Good. I'll take this one, Tanner. Yeah, quick wrap up here. As I said in the beginning, prices are going up, and the value of curtailing load is going up. Right? Those are highly correlated. You saw some 7-figure examples that Tanner just gave, and particularly doing it at the right time can potentially lower almost every cost component, right, of your electricity bill. The other point is just DR can seem daunting and complicated, but in many cases it's not. There are these new tools that we talked about, like the generators that were previously ineligible, that are making it easier to participate at almost any facility. And as budgets increase, it's worth taking a second look, and just reiterating that previous slide. Those enrollments are just around the corner. We all have sort of busy days and busy lives. If you are interested in participating in programs this year, I would get those things started now. Obviously, if folks need help, they could reach out to your energy advisor. You could reach out to us. We do have time for a few questions, so we did get a few. First one, maybe some of the kind of the basics around demand response. Are there any costs associated with enrolling in demand response?
Yeah, I can take that one.
Go ahead. Yep.
So no, there typically are not costs corresponding to demand response. And if there are costs through any sort of demand response provider, they're happy to roll that up and ultimately finance it through the programs. So there's no out-of-pocket expense for participation.
Got it. How about the flip side of that in terms of penalties? I'm not sure if it's the flip side, but are there penalties associated with participation?
Yeah, I can take that one as well. Flip side or not, there are no penalties associated with participating in demand response. So the worst case scenario is you're not a good fit for whatever reason. Maybe it's just not working out facility-wise, and you perform at 0% during a test or anything of that nature. You would just earn $0 in that program, and PJM or the grid operator would say, okay, maybe don't enroll in the future. So there's no out-of-pocket expenses. It would just be $0 is the worst case scenario.
Got it. One question that came in also is, and I think this is related to what you were saying with cold storage, but the value of thermal storage was the question. Maybe it's a little bit of a repeat of what you were saying there, Tanner.
Yeah, so any sort of way to shift your load from a time where the grid might be peaking or there's some sort of grid constraint which would cause prices to be higher, or any sort of resiliency issues, that would allow for an opportunity where thermal storage in the form of, I believe the specific question was about ice, that you would be able to actually ride through that event and participate in demand response through that method.
Got it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll add a little bit there, just on the question of what if I do this versus that, as far as can I turn off a light versus turn on a generator. For most of these programs, the value of that action isn't derived by how you do it. It's just the value of that megawatt or the value of that curtailment. So most of them, they don't care whether you're deploying a generator to reduce your load or turning off lights or turning off HVAC or the system. The value of that megawatt in the program is market derived. A lot of them, like in PJM, have to do with that certain capacity price that's cleared for that year, right? So how you do it is a lot up to you operationally. Like what's easy, what's best for you. The value is more driven by the market. The ROI is obviously like the asset you have versus the asset you don't have versus the opportunity cost of running the plant versus not running the plant. All that is very specific, and we can help you with some of those numbers. But the revenue from the programs are agnostic to how you curtail.
Got it. I'm going to read into one of these other questions, and I think is there a minimum participation level, below which DR is not going to make sense? And while you're answering that, I'm going to get my lights to turn back on.
Sort of yes and sort of no. I think that the minimum amount really just depends on, as Bratcher kind of alluded to, what you're willing to put in. So if you have a facilities person running around turning off a 50 kW HVAC system, that's going to be kind of expensive to do. And also you're not going to make that much money from it. So it's sort of a business decision of what makes the most sense to you. And then in terms of the theoretical limits, demand response companies typically don't want to enroll clients below, call it 100 kW. And that's sort of where their threshold is, that it makes sense to actually enroll people.
Got it. Another one, how often do these programs get called upon?
Yeah, I can take that one as well. So sort of a nuanced answer across the country. There have been calls this past year in New York for their operating reserve program and in MISO for their operating reserve program. But then there's also the examples where in PJM, the last RTO-wide dispatch was in 2022. In ERCOT, the last dispatch was in 2023. So you might go a couple of years without having a single event, and then sometimes you might have multiple events in a season. In the example, typically, people will ask this question, so just going to get to it before we get there. In the event where there is no event called, and you only participated through sort of a test dispatch, your participation will be graded based off that test dispatch alone, and there's no reduction of payment because there was an event called.
Okay. Another question, I think it's embedded in several questions that we're getting here, but how do I know if my generator is approved to participate? We talk about these new rules. How do I know for sure if it's able to participate?
So we sort of recommend going to a third-party environmental consultant just to see whether that it's approved. You can go through the demand response provider just to make things simple, or you can go outside of that. But ultimately, the regulations that changed were federally. So what that does is it pushes the regulations if they're more stringent at the local or state level. That's ultimately what would govern whether you can or cannot participate in these programs. But we recommend going to some sort of third-party verification just to make sure that it's okay.
Got it. Here's one that's I kind of like. It's in the weeds a little bit, but can curtailing my load improve my offers for electricity supply? Bratcher, you want to?
Yeah,
Take
I'll
a
take
swing?
that. The answer is yes, most of the time, yes. So depending on how you're structuring your retail product and which cost components you're requiring that supplier to fix versus float, then it varies. But just being curtailable at the times when the grid is typically at its maximum price or there's significant price risk makes you cheaper to serve in almost any product structure. So the value of curtailability isn't just avoiding capacity cost or receiving a demand response revenue payment. It's also in a lot of those other cost components that Brian was talking about at the very beginning. From a supply point of view, if you happen to curtail your load when prices are most expensive, you are cheaper to serve, right? How that retail product is structured depends on who takes the majority of that benefit, you or the supplier. But any customer of ours or client that is curtailable and is looking at a demand response type product as in their suite of tools, we're absolutely going to be talking about how do we make sure that we leverage that supply contract to maximize the benefit of your curtailability.
Yeah. The thing that I'll add there too is there are some suppliers who are actually creating their own demand response programs inside of their electricity supply contracts. So it's essentially just a different party paying you for your load flexibility. So those are also ways that, embedded inside of your electricity contract, you may be able to save money or get payments. I'm trying to keep to our promise shorter form, so I'm going to go with one last question. I know we got a lot more than this, but if certainly if folks want to follow up, we'll give you some information on how you can do that. But maybe another sort of basic question that came in, which is, can these programs sort of max out? Meaning, I want to participate but can't because they sort of get closed.
So,
I mean,
yeah,
no,
go ahead,
Tanner.
Roger.
The short answer is yes, they can get maxed out. Some of these programs in states like Texas that may have a lot of crypto mining, you may have those crypto miners take up the vast majority of a program, or if it's a utility specific program, they can be fully subscribed. So as the values increase, yes, they can. Some of these programs can be fully subscribed, but it is absolutely specific to your specific utility and the programs that you're looking into.
Awesome.
Is that adequate, Tanner? I think
That's adequate.
Right.
Yeah.
Tanner, you want to go to the last slide? It just has, yeah, there you go. So there's our information. Like I said, we were not able to get to all of the questions, and some of them were pretty deep. It'd take a lot longer than the time we have here, but feel free certainly to reach out to us or your energy advisor. But appreciate everybody joining us today. On behalf of Eric and Tanner, we thank you. Appreciate it.